Call to order the first meeting of the 2018 session of the Senate Finance Committee. If adjusting to the electronics, we're going to do the roll call electronically, and the clerk will open the roll. So if you will please note your presence by voting yea. If you would close the roll, do we have a quorum, sir? Quorum is present, Mr. Chairman. All right, thank you very much. Before we get into this morning's agenda, I want to recognize that we have our dearly beloved senior friend back, John Garrett, who is the committee clerk, and you're maturing very nicely. We're delighted to have you back, sir. And we have an intern who is a graduate student at the University of Virginia who is with us, and that is Griffin Trong. We're very nice to have you, sir. We'll try not to make your life too miserable, even if you are over there with all those spiders. On that, we're also very fortunate to have two pages with us. First of all, we have a very charming young lady that has been assigned to us, and that's Mackenzie Grace Marker, who comes from downtown Mechanicsville. Very nice to have you with us. And we also have Jacob Tyler Kirkland, who is from Manassas Park. So thank you for being with us. And we'll look forward to torturing you as we go through the process here. The first thing on the agenda today is an explanation of things that exceed my intellectual capacity, and that is some information on the electronic voting system. And Hobie and Jonathan are going to chat with us about that, and I'm sure I'll require remedial training.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Just to remind, I think all of you have been using the technology in the other rooms. One of the places where this room is a little different because we share it with the House. You don't have the convenience of the bell when we open the vote. So the other committee rooms, we were able to modify the audio system to have a bell in this room. We have a diminished role in the audio system because it's for the room, not for the House or for the Senate. And when talking about audio, just be very mindful as you're in the room that we're in a room with about 25 microphones. You're always in proximity to microphones, so good microphone etiquette as you're having conversations. Why do you have the perception I'm staring at you? I think I'm on camera saying that, so it's been nice working with y'all. But please be mindful, we are also live streaming, so the public can go back. They can watch us live. We are closed captioned. We are also archiving so that if someone does miss a meeting, they can go back and they can listen to us or watch us later. If y'all have any suggestions for the system is built in-house. So we have full capacity to make changes or make it function the way that you all want it to function to make your committee process run better. Unless Hobie has any additional comments, I'm going to take my seat. Thank y'all for the opportunity to let us do this. It's been a great project for Hobie and I and the rest of the team.
Where is the off button?
Down.
All right, thank you all very much, and I'm sure that I will be one of the more challenged senators on this, but we will enjoy working through this. Starting on the agenda, the committee organization, if you will look in your notebook, you will see that there are a number of tabs. And Jason, are you going to walk us through that, sir?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity on behalf of the staff to be able to walk you through everything that we have today before we get to our compelling overview of the governor's introduced budget. Before we start, I will note the green document, the overview of the budget, has been printed and distributed to the committee members. For any public that wants copies, those are available online this year. First, in front of tab 1 in the notebook is a letter from the chairman to the committee members outlining the responsibilities of the subcommittee and the expectation for each of the subcommittee members during the subcommittee deliberations. Behind the blue sheet there is a listing of the subcommittee membership, the staff listing with areas of responsibility with the retirements and transition of Dick Hickman and Betsy Daly. We have 7 staff now here to serve your needs across the budget areas. Please feel free to reach out to us at any point in time, and they will be walking through the budget summaries. Behind tab 3 is the January calendar of the subcommittee meetings, and we are well underway with all of the subcommittees having met at least once. Behind tab 4 is the process for acting on bills that are referred to the committee. As you will recall, typically bills are handled here in the Finance Committee, and some occasions HHR, the public safety bills from courts of justice where the collective impact may have a budgetary implication, and oftentimes transportation as well will take up bills if they are complex so that the subcommittee may make a recommendation to the full committee. Behind tab 5 is consideration for tax credits. The policy is not deviated from our tradition of the past several years in which we prefer to hear tax credits in the long session this year, and that the committee has a preference for grants over tax credits. Mr. Chairman, if there are no questions for me on the organization of the committee and the notebook, I will turn it over to my co-director, April Keyes.
Jason, thank you for that overview. I made a decision to spare you the torturous recitation of the content of the introductory letter from Senator Hanger and myself that is right in front of tab 1. But just because we did not torture you by going over every item does not mean it should be ignored. So I would encourage each member of the Finance Committee to read that very carefully. The points that are recited in there are familiar with you. We just would like to refamiliarize yourself with them. Under tab 1, under Senator Sasslaw, let me get through this, please, my good friend. You may have noticed we have rearranged the seating a little bit, but we do have a timeout chair right there where there's nobody on either side. You'll note under tab number 1, under the subcommittees, that there have been some very modest adjustments on the subcommittees. Senator Stewart has been added to several of the subcommittees, and because of the extraordinary workload and the weightiness of what's going on in the area of health and human resources, there have been some additions to that committee as well. Under the tab 2, you'll see our distinguished and extraordinarily competent members of the Senate Finance staff with their contacts. So that is there for your convenience. Under tab 4, please read that. That's the procedure for acting on bills that are referred. Tax credits are always an intriguing issue, and the policy dealing with that is under tab 5, so I would encourage you to read those. At Wednesday's meeting, when Senator Hanger is presiding, there will be a pop quiz on the substantive provisions under each of those tabs, and it will not be anonymous grading. So with that, Jason and April, we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just going to start us off. This is the staff's overview of both Senate Bill 29 and Senate Bill 30, so the close of this current biennium and then the biennium It starts July 1. This is just the outline. We're going to start off with an overview and then move into resources, and then we'll conclude with capital outlay. As you know, there are two bills up this session. It's Senate Bill 29, often referred to as the caboose bill. Those amendments are going in, like I mentioned, essentially to the last 6 months of this budget. It reflects fiscal year 2017 revenue surplus and adjustments to the forecast for fiscal 18, based on both fall forecasting and what we collected in the tax amnesty. It becomes effective when signed by the governor. Senate Bill 30, the next biennial budget will be for fiscal year 19 and fiscal year 20. It will address the additional spending requirements over those next 2 years, and as I mentioned, goes into effect July 1. Just to start us off with a little cheat sheet, what you're going to notice in this budget are there's some key themes, especially in Senate Bill 30. There's funding for mandated and high priority items, Medicaid forecast, K-12 rebenchmarking, increases in inmate health care costs, increases in state employee health care, and then the second half of the year compensation increase for employees. But more key than even that, in this budget, there's an effort to maintain and improve structural balance and then increase cash liquidity, and that's in reference to comments that we have received from the rating agencies. There's also some additional investments in higher education in the areas of financial aid, base operations, infrastructure, and research. And then the other areas that see some decent-sized increases are economic development and workforce, which also translates over in higher education as well. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Charles to cover the resources section.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Charles Kennington. I'm going to go over resources and then commerce and trade, beginning with slide 6 in the caboose bill. Proposed amendments to the current budget include $294.4 million in general fund resources above those assumed in Chapter 836. Of that, $134.9 million results from upward revisions to the general fund revenue forecast. The largest increases came in individual withholding and corporate income tax, while the forecast for individual non-withholding was reduced. This also includes a net balance adjustment of $177.7 million. This would include things like positive adjustments to the 2017 fiscal year-end balance for things like the 2017 revenue surplus, as well as unexpended general fund appropriations. It also includes some negative balance adjustments for monies that are already committed, such as deposits to the Water Quality Fund and Healthcare Fund and the Revenue Cash Reserve. Net transfers are reduced by $18.1 million, and the proposed net new spending totals $101.2 million, and when combined with the $8.4 million unappropriated balance in Chapter 836, $201.6 million is carried over to the next biennium. This slide shows in tabular form what I just explained. It provides a little more detail. Again, you can see there's a $201.6 million carry forward balance. Proposed new spending totals $238.1 million in the caboose bill, and proposed savings totals $136.9 million. The largest spending increases would be the deposits to the Revenue Cash Reserve and Medicaid. Largest savings comes from additional lottery proceeds, but you'll hear more about these when my colleagues take to the podium. Turning now to the next biennium and Senate Bill 30. The general fund revenue forecast assumes economic growth rates of 3.7% and 3.9%, which is not materially different from the forecast presented at the Governor's Advisory Council on Revenue Estimates. However, after proposed policy adjustments, revenue growth will need to be 4% in each year to meet the forecast. I will explain briefly on the next slide what the policy adjustments are. The forecast does include the collar on non-withholding income tax collections. This reduces the forecast by $201 million in the first year, $209 million in the second. It might be helpful just to remind the members what the collar is. As you know, non-withholding income tax collections comes from non-wage income mostly. Things like capital gains, dividends, interest, rent, and pass-through income from businesses, which makes it more volatile than your other revenue sources and more difficult to forecast even with a fairly sophisticated econometric model. So the collar is just an organized way to reduce the non-withholding forecast when the model predicts growth that's outside of historical norms. Okay, so non-withholding is normally around 16% of general fund revenues. When the model predicts a value above that, tax will then make an adjustment, but the adjustment that they make is limited to 1% of general fund revenues. Lastly, the revenue outlook is complicated somewhat by the fact that there is federal tax reform. And the impact of that is still being worked out. We are actually going to have tomorrow a presentation from the Department of Taxation that will give us an overview of the impact of federal tax reform. I mentioned policy adjustments. This slide shows you what those are. There are three. The first one is federal tax conformity. You will see a conformity bill next week that does not include any of the federal tax changes that take effect in tax year 2018, but it does include one provision related to the expansion of charitable deduction limits, which was passed to encourage support for hurricane relief efforts. That provision is estimated to have a revenue impact of minus $3.3 million in FY19. The second proposed policy adjustment is to expand audits, which the Department of Taxation estimates will increase revenues by $18.5 million over the 2 years. And finally, there is a proposal to require tax preparers to notify the department when there is evidence that the confidentiality of taxpayer information has been compromised. It's expected to increase revenues $300,000 each year by preventing or reducing refund fraud. In addition to the $201.6 million carry forward balance and the official general fund revenue forecast, there is a net positive adjustment to the balance, and transfers are estimated at $1.2 billion over the 2 years, which brings the total general fund resources available for appropriation to $42.45 billion. Proposed new spending totals $1.7 billion over the base budget, leaving an unappropriated balance of $12.1 million. This next slide shows the largest new spending and saving proposals in the introduced budget. Not surprisingly, the largest item is Medicaid. And again, you'll hear more about these as my colleagues take to the microphone. I'll pause here for questions. If there are any questions about resources.
Senator Sasslaw.
Has there been any way to gauge how much of the additional revenue of non-withholding that came in December was not so much the economy, but a function of the new tax thing, which drove a lot of people to pay early?
We asked that question of the Department of Taxation, and I'm not sure that we have an answer right now to tell you exactly how much of that is from prepayment or the effects of that federal tax reform. I will ask that to be added to the department's comments tomorrow.
Okay.
Not sure I have a good answer for you today.
I think that would be an appropriate request. Any further questions from any member of the committee? If not, sir.
And I will turn to Commerce and Trade. The introduced budget includes a net increase of $7.9 million general fund over the biennium compared to the base budget. That includes a 1.6% increase in FY19 and 2.3% increase in FY20. The budget proposes a total of $44 million from the general fund the first year and $41.3 million from the general fund the second year for economic development incentive payments. This slide shows the total proposed for each program in the Economic Development Incentives Payments Holding Account. I will just note that the VIP grant amounts are $5.9 million higher than the base, and the VDIG grant is $4.2 million higher than the base 2018 budget. And these are based on previously awarded grants that are paid out after the recipient companies meet performance targets. You'll notice there are no proposed appropriations for the Advanced Shipbuilder Production Facility Grant or the Pulp, Paper, and Fertilizer Advanced Manufacturing Grant. Both of those were included in the 2018 budget, so those represent reductions compared to the base. In the Department of Housing and Community Development, there is a proposal for $7.5 million from the general fund to establish the Virginia Grocery Investment Fund. This is intended to incentivize the development of supermarkets and other healthy food retailers in underserved communities. You will also see a bill, I believe it's Senate Bill 37, that is co-patroned by Senators Dance and Stanley that would establish this fund. There's also a recommendation to double support for the Virginia Telecommunications Initiative for broadband deployment. That would go from $1 million to $2 million general fund each year. There is a proposal to remove $1.3 million from the budget for building collaborative communities and building entrepreneurial economies grant programs. There's a proposal to increase by $100,000 general fund each year for rapid rehousing efforts. And there is a proposal of $1.7 million general fund in the second year, which would fund the Commonwealth's match as part of the National Disaster Resilience Grant. The total would be $5 million over a 3-year period. And moving now to Go Virginia, there is, the budget does recommend additional general fund spending of $1.3 million in administrative support for the department to administer Go Virginia. It also proposes to appropriate $3.2 million from non-general fund monies. This would be unused capacity building funds to increase allocations for the portion of grants that are allocated to regions based on their share of population. The idea is to provide a minimum of $750,000 per year for each of the regional councils. There is a proposal to deposit, excuse me, the proposed deposits to the Virginia Growth and Opportunity Fund are the same as the 2018 appropriation, $24.5 million. There's also language included in the budget that proposes to override the requirement that not more than 90% of monies in the fund should be allocated or awarded in any given year. In the Economic Development Partnership Authority, there is the budget proposes new spending of $2.5 million general fund the first year and $5 million from the general fund the second year to create what is basically a turnkey, customized workforce solution for companies that are that have been incentivized to relocate or expand in the Commonwealth. There's also an additional $200,000 from the general fund each year for marketing. And there's a recommendation to increase funding by $364,000 each year to provide support for the division of incentives. You'll recall that last session, the General Assembly enacted legislation which reformed the VEDP, and part of that reform required the creation of a division within the agency that's responsible for reviewing, vetting, tracking economic development incentives. Other items in commerce and trade, there is a proposed $2.2 million from the general fund each year, over the 2 years to incentivize solar energy and energy storage development. There is a proposal for $628,000 general fund each year for the Fort Monroe Authority to supplant the loss of federal funding. In addition, not in commerce and trade, but elsewhere in the budget, there's $2 million in the first year from maintenance reserve, which is designated for building and utility repairs. There's an additional $250,000 from the general fund proposed for the Department of Small Business and Supplier Diversity for software upgrades. An additional $200,000 the general fund is proposed each year to expand tourism marketing, and $150,000 from the general fund is proposed to support a multi-year tourism development initiative in partnership with the Richmond Raceway. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my summary of commerce and trade. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to address them.
Does anyone have any questions under the category of commerce and trade based on the presentation? If not, thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
We appreciate it. Next, we'll go to higher ed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Many of you sit on the Education Subcommittee, and we did a longer version of higher education the other day, so I'll try to make it brief and just hit the high points. Overall, in Senate Bill 30, there were no significant actions, in Senate Bill 29, so that's why you're not going to see anything there. In Senate Bill 30, there were proposed amendments that result in a net increase of about $245 million over the biennium. About $127 million of those actions are related to technical adjustments that in some years have been reflected in base budgets instead of this way that it was done this time around. Another big chunk, 80.6 million of the biennium is to support base operations and undergraduate financial need-based aid. And of that, 21.1 million is for base adequacy, which is the formula where we take general fund and non-general fund resources to look at how we're supporting the education and general programs, or what essentially is mainly the academic side. The institutions that were below 100% this time around were Old Dominion University, Virginia Military Institute, Richard Bland College, and Eastern Virginia Medical School. And on a later slide, I have that broken down by institution by year. 14 million of that 80.6 was for base operations at George Mason University in an effort to reflect enrollment growth according to the outgoing McAuliffe administration. 45.5 million is for the need-based undergraduate student financial aid, which continues to be a lower percentage than we were used to doing prior to the Great Recession. And then lastly, I want to mention that there's 16 million for higher education research available under the Virginia Research Investment Committee. That's not reflected in the total above, and normally would have also been reflected as part of base budget adjustments. Slide 22 just provides a summary overall. I'll skip those first two since we've
Excuse me,
discussed
April.
them. Yes, sir.
If I may,
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Sasslaw has a question.
April, what's the total amount that we are, for research, that higher ed is connected with for the biennium?
I have a chart upstairs. If I could get that to you later, I've
Okay.
got it broken down by
Sure.
institution.
Okay,
I'd be
thank
happy to
you.
do that. Thank you, Senator. Mr. Chairman. Skipping the first two lines, since I've covered that already, there's another 4.3 million over the biennium for technology infrastructure. That's at the University of Virginia Wise, Virginia State, and the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. There's an additional almost 4 million at the University of Virginia Wise to enhance academic programs there. The workforce credential grant has been upped by 2 million per year, or 4 million over the biennium. There's a number of items under the State Council of Higher Education for Virginia that amount to about $3 million. And then the higher ed centers, mostly for workforce or operation and maintenance, is about 1.8 million. That, however, does not include new funding for Southwest Virginia Higher Ed Center. Under SCHEV also is the tuition assistance grants, which go to students who attend nonprofit private colleges. There's 1.8 million in the second year to move the awards from roughly $3,300 per student to $3,350. And then there's also a $500 teacher supplement for those students who are seniors who wish to be teachers. At Norfolk State University, there's cybersecurity and cyber psychology programs in biofuel research. However, that research money is different in that that is also under the educational and general or academic side. That amounts to 1.3 million. And then there are a number of smaller items that total to about 4.1 million, includes things like census forecasting at UVA, positions for Richard Bland related to AP audit findings, monitoring at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, veteran counseling programs at William & Mary, a $200,000 planning grant at the community college system to consider how to offer no tuition for students who would get either a credential or an associate's degree. There's also a reduction at the New College Institute of money that was put in for planning and for other operations, and then $500,000 for the Jefferson Lab. That I've already mentioned that research line, so I'll skip that, but I will tell you those technical actions plus on that 139.8 million, there's 13.1 of that is related to restructuring benefits, the restoration for those institutions that meet their performance standards. They're supposed to be able to keep both the interest earnings and the credit card rebate. That has been restored this biennium, and as you know, that's something the Senate Finance Committee has restored a number of times. Moving on, this is the chart I promised on slide 23 for base adequacy and base operations, how it breaks down for those institutions per year. Slide 24 just is an effort to show you how the 17 institutions, how that money got distributed by year as well. On slide 25, I just want to mention several other items. There's 83 million per year in bond proceeds for the Higher Education Equipment Trust Fund. That supports things like the replacement of computers and specialized research equipment. That amount, however, is identical to the fiscal year 2018 outgoing allocation. Salary increase is also in central accounts for faculty. That the amount of the total that equals is about 11.3 million. There's language related to reserve funds for institutions. Essentially, essentially saying you can have unexpended educational and general appropriations at the end of the fiscal year, and it can create a reserve fund that shall not exceed 3% of the general fund appropriation for the E&G programs in the most recently completed fiscal year. However, the use of the reserve fund in the future must be approved by the Board of Visitors, and then a detailed plan on that use must be reported immediately to the Governor, the Secretary of Finance, the Secretary of Education, and the Chairman of the Money Committees. Lastly, there's a mandatory fee increase language, and that basically changes that limit on those mandatory fees, other than the ones that fall under the educational and general programs, from 5 down to 3%. However, that would not eliminate current exemptions, so I'm not sure that would change practice. And that concludes higher education, Mr. Chairman, unless there are additional questions.
Does any member of the committee have any questions of April regarding a presentation on higher education? Seeing none, we'll look forward to hearing from Sarah on K through 12 public education.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Picking up on slide 25, this is slide 27. This is the overview of direct aid to localities for public education. And beginning with a base year for FY 2018 in Chapter 836 of just over $6 billion, the proposed budget would add $206.5 million in the first year in general funds, plus $309.4 million in general funds in the second year, for a total increase for direct aid of $515.9 million. Going down that first column on general funds, the percent change in the first year is 3.4%, and going across, you can add on to that an additional 1.6% over FY 2019. There are also proposed increases in the non-general funds. In direct aid, this is your federal funds for education, lottery proceeds, and literary fund. And that does include a true-up of federal funds, not necessarily a new increase of federal funds in that figure. Going on down below on a per-pupil basis, you can see that the percent changes are slightly lower on a per-pupil basis because there is some enrollment growth. And going across to the right, by the second year on a per-pupil basis, the average state-funded per-pupil amount is just over $5,000, but this does vary by locality depending on composite index and other factors. Slide 28 summarizes on one page all of the actions in direct aid. You see at the bottom right the $515.9 million proposed increase that I mentioned. The single largest item, as usual, is the biennial rebenchmarking of SOQ costs, $481 million. And the next slide summarizes this, so I will proceed with the rest of the lines and come back to rebenchmarking. The single largest policy action is the proposed funding for a second year 2% compensation increase with a date similar to those for the other employee groups. That's $51.3 million in the second year. Next proposed action is $11.5 million in the first year, as intended as no loss funding for those 32 school divisions that, because of either enrollment decline or an increase in their composite index or a combination of the two, would have been scheduled to receive fewer state dollars in FY19 than in 18, despite the additional rebenchmarking dollars. There would be some technical issues to look at on this item. When I say it was intended to address the ones that would have experienced the loss due to a couple supple steps, we need to look more closely at exactly how that might be implemented if you choose to approve that item. Next, in the second year, is funding for the state's share of a full-time principal in small elementary schools. Currently, the SOQ does allow and fund a part-time principal for elementary schools that are smaller than 300 students. We have about 1,100 elementary schools in the state. About 187 are smaller than 300. Although most of those do, in practice, have a full-time principal that's funded locally, there are about a dozen that actually utilize a part-time principal as allowed. The next is also a second-year item, proposed funding to increase the at-risk add-on range to 14%. You'll recall an increase in this program 2 years ago. This funding adds an add-on to basic aid of 1% for those like Falls Church that have the lowest percentage of students eligible for free lunch, and the highest, so 14%, for the ones at the highest end. Petersburg is at 78%. The next row is extending the FY18 Governor's School Funding Policy. So this is not an increase for governor of schools over 18. The funding policy approved in 2016, that 2.5% increase in per pupil and $50 per course. The language indicated that this was for 17 and 18 only, in case there was interest in continuing to pursue different approaches to the funding policy. So rather than propose a change, this action just reflects continuing the resolution from 2016. There are some other smaller items, including an increase of $500,000 each year for positive behavior intervention support, or PBIS, to attempt to prevent suspension and expulsion whenever possible to keep students in the classroom. There's proposed new funding, $500,000 each year for a new fund for principal recruitment and retention in the school divisions that have MOUs with the department, so Petersburg, Richmond, and Franklin. There's also, again, proposed funding of $480,000 each year for cybersecurity 2-week camps that you have seen in the past, and several other smaller items, which are an increase for Virginia Reading Corps, Project Discovery, and some praxis assistance for minority teachers and national board certification. The last row there is the reduction due to applying the VPI, Preschool Initiative, non-participation rate. This is not a policy change. This is just continuing the 25.4% non-participation rate that has routinely been done. Back to rebenchmarking on slide 29. This is a summary of the over 60 discrete steps that are involved in rebenchmarking. At the October committee meeting, you had a detailed briefing on the 25 steps to date at that point, which are reflected in the top half of the chart. The key factors are salaries, inflation, to update the base year 2 from FY 2016 up to the beginning of the biennium, also enrollment and healthcare premiums. Going down on the updates that occurred since September, the projected sales tax revenues are reflected. Also, the local composite index figures have been updated, and that results in a net decrease in costs statewide, although increases and decreases locally. It's also a partial offset for enrollment, which just lowers the increases you see above the line for September. For the second half, it's still an increase statewide. There is savings on a biennial basis of $45.1 million due to lower VRS rates compared to Chapter 836. And then two large items at the bottom are general fund savings of about $80.4 million due to the expected increase in non-general fund lottery revenues up to $586 million per year. Unfortunately, there is a need then to also backfill about the same amount, $80 million in the literary fund due to one-time revenues included in the forecast and our use over time of this for SOQ retirement rather than school construction loans. Turning to the Department of Education, those of you on the Education Subcommittee will hear more on each of these from the agency this Thursday afternoon. The first is funding to automate the teacher licensure process, which now continues to be a completely paper process for the 33,000 transactions they receive each year. There's also proposed additional funding in the second year for the e-media digital content item. Proposed increased funding in each year for kindergarten readiness program. There is new funding in the Department for Environmental Education. This is a function that at one time had been done in the Department of Conservation and Recreation. And an increase for the school performance report card to do the next round of changes needed for this due to accreditation changes and federal changes. And then some smaller items that are listed for you on the slide that I will not detail at this time. That completes K through 12 education. The next slide is on the other education agencies. If there are no questions on K-12.
Okay. Yes, Senator McDougall.
Sarah, when on, I guess it's page 29, the prevailing salaries and other personnel related, is any of that money going to teachers or is that support staff, and is that geographically focused in certain jurisdictions in the Commonwealth?
So this is updating the base year data for SOQ funds salaries based on the prevailing amount. So last biennium it was based on FY 2014 data. So this reflects updating that for FY 16. So all the actions statewide 416, as well as funding the 2% increase in FY 2018 that the state provided. So those two pieces, and it definitely does both include the instructional teacher side and the support side.
Mr. Chairman, so Sarah, if I'm understanding it right, then this is, in essence, the Commonwealth picking up this locality cost for all raises for instructional and other personnel.
Those that occurred between 2014 and 2016.
Okay.
Not all of them, because we're limited in the positions that are funded based on the staffing standards. So the ones that they choose to employ beyond the minimums, we don't share in.
Thank you.
Any further questions of Sarah on K-12? If not, Sarah, thank you very much, and we will move on to.
Would you like to
Oh, I'm
do
sorry,
other
yeah,
ed and
no, I'm
retirement
sorry.
real
I
quick?
apologize.
There are a couple items in the other education agencies. In the Commission for the Arts, the introduced budget proposes increasing funds by $250,000 in the first year and $1.5 million in the second year for grants to arts organizations, over the $3.7 million annual amount that had been in place for some time. There's also proposed funding in the Library of Virginia to replace their outdated electronics record system, which is nearing the end of its life. And proposed funding for construction of an Eastern Shore Library, in addition to the formula funding on an operating basis for the other libraries statewide. Some funding for O&M for a new building at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, which is due to open early in FY19. There's just reference to some capital items that are included in the capital outlay portion of the budget for a couple of the agencies. And then under Jamestown, Yorktown commemorations, just note that you may recall last year, most of the other education agencies received reductions of 7.5%, but there was an additional targeted reduction for the commemorations budget that was not restored in the introduced budget. Just one slide on retirement, this time very briefly. As you're probably aware, we actually are getting the benefit of some rate savings this time in the introduced budget based on the VRS board-approved rates, savings of $13.3 million general funds, net from all the plans, as well as some additional savings due to the other post-employment benefits. Also within the agency, there are several items reflecting non-general fund adjustments for several initiatives within VRS. And that completes my portion of the presentation.
Any questions of Sarah on the retirement slide? If not, thank you very much for your presentation. And next we will hear on Health and Human Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Flipping to slide 35, it's just an overview of Senate Bill 29, the caboose bill for Health and Human Resources. There's net spending of $60.5 million general fund compared to the current budget. Most of the spending, most of the spending is related to the Medicaid forecast. There's also an offset of $40.5 million from the healthcare fund, which is used for state match for Medicaid. There's $40.5 million of savings from that due to increased revenue, and there was a $28 million cash balance that was carried forward from FY17 that helps fund Medicaid. There were a few other items related to mainly caseload growth, so adjustments for the children's health insurance programs, child welfare, Part C early intervention, and others. Slide 36, looking at the overview of HHR and Senate Bill 30, this just gives you off the base budget for HHR of just over $6.4 billion. You'll see the proposed increases and decreases. It nets to about $551 million in additional general fund over the biennium for HHR. And you can see with the increase in the base of 2.5% the first year, 6% the second year in the general fund side, the increases on the non-general fund side are much higher. You'll see over 34% in the second year. That's mainly tied to the inclusion of Medicaid expansion in the introduced budget, and the federal funds that would be drawn down is related to that. I just noted at the bottom just the different capital projects related to HHR. I won't go over them in detail. It's just for your reference because April will go over that as part of the capital outlay. Moving on to this is just a summary, slide 37 of the major policy and funding items. I'll go into more detail in a few minutes about Medicaid expansion and how that's included in the introduced budget, as well as talk about the hospital provider assessment, which is used to pay for the cost of Medicaid expansion. There's also some additional funding. There's a net $32.4 million in funding related to compliance with the DOJ settlement agreement related to the training centers and the developmental disability waivers. Lastly, and to note in behavioral health, there's some additional funding and investments, over $51 million for community-based services and $33 million for operations of the state hospitals. Slide 38 is just a summary of the major general fund changes in Medicaid. So just note, you can see most of it is mandatory spending, over $765 million. The other spending of the $152 million includes things like the behavioral health and DOJ spending as well. Looking at the decreases, you see the largest savings is a result of Medicaid expansion, the $383 million. This is just what's in HHR. There's a separate $44 million in savings that's reflected in the Department of Corrections budget, which brings it to the total of $427 million. You'll see there's DOJ-related training center savings as the training centers continue to wind down. Southwest Training Center is planned for closure this June. Savings are reflected as those close. That's the $28 million. Then there's some additional revenue to the healthcare fund that offsets Medicaid. That's the $18 million. And there's a few other minor saving strategies in HHR. Moving to slide 39, the introduced budget includes expansion. This will cover all individuals up to 138% of poverty. This, of course, has been proposed in past years as well. It would actually be effective beginning October 1st, 2018. Out of a potential of 400,000 individuals that are eligible, it's projected that 300 would actually enroll, and that's what all the estimates are based off of. The cost of the expansion, just about $307 million, would actually be covered. What's included in the budget is a provider assessment in hospitals, and I'll actually go over that a little bit more in a minute. And I just wanted to note that the federal match rate for the expansion population is currently will be 94%. This is currently 94% in 2018. It drops to 93% in 2019, and then 2020 and beyond is the 90% that goes on from that point. Jen, just to note at the last bullet is that at the bottom line, $421 million in savings was allocated in the budget. And as I'll show you, since the provider assessment pays for the cost, that entire amount went to the bottom line to be allocated for other spending in the budget. This chart just gives you the summary. I won't go over in great detail at the top. You'll see the kind of the total cost that comes to the $307 million for the biennium. Like I said, those costs, I listed them as non-general fund costs because technically they will be paid for by the revenue from the provider assessment. You can also see that on the non-general fund side, all the way to the right, those are really the federal funds that would flow down, which would be over $3 billion for the biennium. The savings is broken out before. The largest savings comes from essentially indigent care, which is currently paid for the most part within Medicaid at 50% federal match. It would move to 90%, and you would have, or over 90%, you'd have the savings. You then have savings within the community services boards, basically because the uninsured population that they serve would now be covered, most of it would be covered by Medicaid, as well as hospital costs and Department of Corrections facilities would be covered. Most of those inmates would be covered by Medicaid. And lastly, there are a variety of other programs and coverages with the Medicaid that would switch from the current 50% federal match to 90%, as they would actually qualify in the new populations. I just listed at the bottom the Department of Social Services general fund cost. This is for eligibility. It's about $6 million. You have to factor that in to get to the total net savings, which is the $421.7 million. Slide 41, I mentioned the hospital provider assessment. Essentially, the budget includes the actual authority to impose an assessment. Typically, in the past, it has actually been imposed more in a straight, like you would have a percentage, like 3% of total revenue. It's actually designed to be a formula such that it will actually generate and correct itself to generate the exact amount of money that is needed each year to pay for the expansion cost. So there was $307 million in costs. The provider assessment over the biennium would be projected to generate revenue of $307 million to pay for those costs. Kind of the result of that is the assessment would be somewhere in the neighborhood of about 0.5% in the first year, and then it would increase to about 1.4% in the second year. And that's against total net patient revenue for hospitals. Quite a few hospitals are excluded, so the public hospitals are excluded, psychiatric hospitals, rehab, children's, as well as critical access hospitals. So it's mainly focused on just the private acute hospitals. This revenue would be deposited into the healthcare fund, which is used as state match for Medicaid. It's kind of the mechanism that it uses. And the illustration is just trying to show you a little bit about the flow. I won't go into go over it, the flow of the money as it comes in and pays for the cost. I will note too that actually it's actually included in the caboose bill as well, not to actually assess, not to generate any of the fee. I think just to begin the process of calculating how much the assessment would be. Moving to slide 42, talking about mandatory spending for Medicaid. Like I said, Medicaid utilization inflation, that program is the $575 million. We talked about this at the annual meeting back in November, so I won't go over it in great detail. It's down about $8 million from that meeting just because there were 2 corrections that occurred after the official forecast was completed. You'll see the second largest growth is the Children's Services Act. This is primarily in the special education arena where individuals are being placed in private day placements, and that's an ongoing issue that we continue to look at. The famous and Children's Health Insurance Program, the $45.7 million, this is primarily generated from the change in the federal match rate in the second year. Under the Affordable Care Act, Children's Health Insurance moved from 65% federal match to 88%. And it starts to go down in the second year back to the 65%. The second year really just goes halfway, and then in FY 21 and beyond, it would be back to 65%. Of course, this is all depending on congressional action until they reauthorize the Children's Health Insurance Program. We don't really know exactly the mechanics of how that will work. As I mentioned, DOJ, there's $45 million to fund the required 825 slots per the agreement. There's some money for reinvestment of child welfare systems within the world of child welfare, as we have in recent years moved people from state-funded adoption programs to basically federal adoption programs and to get a 50% federal match. Federal law has required that we reinvest those monies in the child welfare, the state monies in child welfare programs. And this item reflects that. It's also an adjustment for information technology funding in the Department of Social Services. This kind of is just trying to true up and make sure that the department is fully funded as they've transitioned from the Unisys mainframe system to the newer system. For the department, there's some additional items for Department of Justice settlement, rental assistance, as well as the health support network. That's for Central Virginia Training Center and that area to provide services to those individuals in the community to continue those services they would have otherwise received in the training center that may not be available in the community. There's increasing caseloads for involuntary mental commitments. Again, this is still, I think we're still seeing the effects of the 2014 bid of last resort legislation. There's also the typical caseload increases for foster care and adoption payments. And you'll see early interventions services under Part C. That caseload continues to increase about 5% a year. And there's a small adjustment to one of the TANF unemployed parents program. Like I said, I won't go over in great detail the Medicaid forecast because we covered this at the annual meeting. I just did want to note, though, that it's projected to grow now at 2.1% in FY19 and 4.2% in FY20. Like I've said before, these are very low growth rates. It's mainly due to the transition of a significant portion of the expenditures of the program from fee-for-service to managed care, and they have factored in savings. This is something that we will just need to continue to monitor to make sure those savings accrue, because if they don't, they'll creep back into future forecasts. So we'll continue to monitor that. I will note too that about $104 million of the projected general fund increase is due to the typical inflation adjustments that are provided for hospitals and nursing homes. Slide 44 just summarizes over $72 million provided for behavioral health spending, which includes implementing same-day access for the remaining 22 community services boards. This was started in this past session, which is the idea of the concept called Step Virginia, which is basically to bring a minimum level of services and consistency across all 40 CSBs. The first service was same-day access, which is basically the idea that you would, the day you go, you will actually be able to see someone and not have to actually wait weeks for an appointment. There's also addressing capacity issues. The state mental health hospitals remain very close to capacity and under a great deal of pressure. So there's additional funding for discharge assistance funds. There's also funding to actually assist the department in working with some nonprofits and stuff to actually fund some assisted living facilities that they can actually transition people out of the state hospitals into in the community. Primary care screening at community services boards. This is the second service that's required by the statute passed last year to go online for CSBs as part of the STEP Virginia program, and that's estimated to cost $11.2 million. There's about $10 million to fully implement electronic health records at all state hospitals. Currently, 3 of them have electronic health records, and this will complete that process. Then there's additional $10 million provided over the biennium for Medicaid-assisted treatment for opioid use disorders. This is the continuation of a federal grant that we got, but the federal grant is expiring, so this would continue it, that funding with state support. There's additional funding for permanent supportive housing, which this committee has supported over the last few years. An additional $7 million that would provide supportive housing for an additional 300 individuals, or close to 300. And lastly, there's also some additional, the big other expenditure is 56 bids at Western State Hospital will come online as that expansion is completed in the second year, and there are operational costs associated with that. Slide 45. These are just other spending items to note in HHR. So it doesn't cover everything because there are very many, but these are the major ones. There were three strategies tied to Medicaid consumer-directed attendance to increase their rates by 2%, to add over 16 hours of overtime, which is something that we've seen before, as well as some additional training funds for them. There are initiatives related to the Virginia Center for Behavioral Rehabilitation. This is the facility for the sexually violent predators. Essentially, the facility is nearing its capacity and they're about to begin construction of the expansion. But in the meantime, until we actually reach, till the new facility comes online, part of it will come online in the second year. The first year, they are actually bringing online 22 bids at Piedmont Geriatric for medically complex individuals, so to help them transition until the new facility fully comes online. There are also some administrative costs, the big one being the Medicaid call center contract. Medicaid has a call center. It also includes a central eligibility processing unit. That contract's coming up for renewal, and there's money built into the budget to cover increased costs for that. There are a few other items related to the DOJ settlements to expand crisis service for children and adults, as well as adding about 50 reserve waiver slots. Reserve slots let you move between waivers, so if your needs change, that there's capacity to transition. There's also additional funding to fully fund the Child Support Office. Essentially, as TANF caseloads decline, they're actually allowed to retain collections for that population of child support payments to fund state operations. As those caseloads decline, those collections decline, so this offsets that to make sure they're fully funded. There's a variety of other spending, additional staff at the Office of the State Medical Examiner, who's seen a dramatic increase in over the last 5 years in the number of overdose deaths that they actually have to autopsy, as well as funding electronic health records at the Virginia Department of Health, and a variety of other items as well. The last thing I would just note too, even though it's not general fund, really the only major action related to the TANF program and budget is, and this is something that we've seen the last few years as well, is $6 million in additional TANF spending each year was included for a long-acting reversible contraception program. And with that, Mr. Chairman, that concludes HHR.
Any questions of the presentation on Health and Human Resources? If not, thank you very much, sir. We appreciate it. Next, we'll move on to Public Safety and Homeland Security. Good morning, Caitlin. How are you?
Good morning. Thank you. Okay. As an overview for public safety, the introduced caboose bill would add a total of $5.1 million in 2018 for public safety for DOC medical expenses and overtime for DFS scientists. The bill also increases estimated net profits to be transferred to the general fund from ABC's enterprise fund by $1.1 million in 2018. The introduced biennial budget would increase general funds by a total of $204 million and non-general funds by an additional $204 million for public safety agencies, and that includes technical adjustments. The bill also assumes $44 million in general fund savings from DOC's operating budget from the proposed Medicaid expansion and increases ABC net profit transfers to the general fund by about $19 million over the biennium. In detail, the caboose bill as introduced would add $5 million in 2018 for DOC's inmate medical costs. Upon initial analysis, the agency is estimating a 5% increase in the cost of off-site inpatient and outpatient care, a 3.8% increase on drugs, and a 2.6% increase on medical care. The introduced budget assumes reallocation of some existing general fund balances to offset a portion of the projected need. The bill also includes $125,000 in general fund for DFS controlled substances and biology scientists to perform overtime in their scientific analysis. The slide includes caseload data for context. In the first quarter of 2018, the backlog for controlled substances was over 10,000 cases with a turnaround time of 108 days, and the backlog for the biology division was over 2,000 with a turnaround time of 152 days. Finally, as I mentioned, the proposed change to Part 3, estimated net profit transfers from ABC's enterprise fund to the general fund would increase those transfers by $1.1 million above what's in Chapter 836, increasing the total transfer to $104.1 million. The table on the next slide details the items included in the biennial budget for the Department of Corrections. As Mike indicated, the bill assumes a total of $44 million in general fund savings as a result of the proposed Medicaid expansion, which is partially offset by an additional $38.3 million in general fund for estimated increase in inmate medical costs. The bill also recommends funding for specialized mental health units that would help the agency keep seriously mentally ill inmates out of restrictive housing. According to DOC, 27% of inmates have some level of mental illness, and about 850 have been identified as seriously mentally ill. This funding would support programs for 119 beds at a time across 3 facilities. Additionally, the bill adds 35 probation and parole officers to address increased caseloads, establishes a specialized residential opioid treatment facility for nonviolent offenders at an existing detention and diversion center, adds 3 medical and mental health positions to fully staff a female unit at Central Virginia Correctional Facility that has capacity for 140 beds, and finally adds a jail death investigator and funding for the Corrections Special Reserve Fund, or Woodrum bills, that Governor McAuliffe was supporting that were estimated to increase state responsible inmates. The Department of State Police would receive about $9 million over the biennium for 10 additional troopers for the Special Operations Division, financing to replace 2 helicopters through the Department of Treasury's Master Equipment Leasing Program. This funding includes funding for the helicopter that was lost in August 2017 and replacement of the existing MedFlight helicopter. Insurance on the downed helicopter was factored into the amounts provided. There is operating support included for the department's Commonwealth Link to Interoperable Communication System, 4 positions over the biennium to conduct criminal intelligence at the Fusion Center, 2 positions in the second year to perform quality control of polygraphs, and 7 positions to support legislation that had been introduced to require universal background checks for gun sales. The bill also there's a note at the bottom that the bill authorizes some non-general funds to enhance the computerized criminal history system. Next, the introduced bill proposes a total of $105 million in non-general fund spending over the biennium for ABC to purchase inventory, acquire new systems and software, increase personnel, and to spend increased revenues from a bill that would raise various licensing fees. The amounts for cost of goods sold were based on a 4.42% increase on projected sales. The point of sales and audit systems acquisition are part of a 3 to 5 year project budget that's estimated at $27 million. And the new email system, Office 365, is part of the agency's transition away from Vita. The bill also recommends funding for 38 positions to support opening new stores and to staff existing high-volume stores, and funding to convert 50 part-time employees to full-time over the biennium to address high employee turnover for wage positions. Finally, the bill would allow the agency to spend a projected $1.9 million a year that in estimated revenues from a bill that would increase licensing fees. And then Part 3 of the introduced bill was amended to increase transfers from ABC's enterprise fund to the general fund by $6.8 million in 2019 and $12.5 million in 2020, above the amount that was assumed in 2018, giving a total net transfer amount of $109.8 million in the first year and $115.5 million in the second year. And there's language change in Part 3 that relates to how the agency can account for depreciation against net profits. Finally, for other public safety agencies, the bill recommends $1 million for the Secretary of Public Safety and Homeland Security to assess and upgrade State Police's Commonwealth Link to Interoperable Communications System. The amount includes $150,000 that is designated for reassessment and updating the statewide interoperability plan, and there's a language requirement to report on that assessment to the money committees, the governor, and DPP by November 2018, with the remaining funds being available for top priority interoperability needs. The bill also provides funding in 8 positions for scientific analysis at DFS. The majority of those positions would be in the controlled substances section, and there is funding for the agency to finance scientific testing equipment through the Master Equipment Leasing Program. The Department of Emergency Management would receive $3 million over the biennium to implement a new emergency preparedness training program for first responders, a coordinator position to manage federal reporting requirements, and a small increase in the second year to purchase additional vehicles through MELP, the Master Equipment Leasing Program. The Department of Military Affairs would receive general fund support for an interagency emergency coordinator, a deputy director in its IT and communications unit, and an emergency response specialist, in addition to funding to conduct cybersecurity assessments for other state agencies. And under DCJS, the bill increases aid to localities with police departments based on projected general fund revenues and increases funding for Drive to Work. And that finishes public safety unless there are any questions.
Does any member of the committee have any questions of Caitlin regarding a presentation of public safety? If not, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next, we'll move to Veterans and Defense Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Turning to slide 55 in Veterans and Defense Affairs. The first bill there, I would note that there is a proposal for a 10.9% increase in the operating budget for the Office of the Secretary. This is part of proposed operating Secretariat increases in 4 different secretariats: Agriculture, Forestry, Finance, HHR, and Veterans Affairs, that range from 10% to 33%. In addition, we haven't touched on it, but in Senate Bill 29, there is a proposal to adjust the compensation for all cabinet secretaries, and those raises range from less than 1% for the Secretary of Finance to more than 8.2% for the Secretary of the Commonwealth. What it does is establishes a common compensation of $172,000 per year for the secretaries. At the Veterans Care Centers in Veterans and Defense Affairs, there is a $14.4 million non-general fund appropriation over the biennium and 265 additional positions for operations at the 4 Veterans Care Centers. There are two new care centers coming online in Virginia Beach and Fauquier County, and the introduced bill proposes a working capital advance of $11.5 million with the expectation that that loan would be repaid from Medicaid and Medicare revenues, private insurance, and other patient revenues. However, the department has not been able to provide a plan of finance to me for that yet, which was requested a week ago. At Benefit Services, there is a proposal for $541,000 and 9 FTE over the biennium. to expand existing Veterans Care benefit offices in the city of Virginia Beach, and open a new one in Fort Belvoir in order to expedite services and reduce wait times. There is a new initiative for veterans entrepreneurship of almost $200,000, and a position and a new initiative for programs for women veterans that recommends about $150,000, and one FTE for veterans programs targeted at women. The Public Safety Subcommittee is expected to get additional detail at its meeting on veterans tomorrow. If no questions for veterans, I'll go to Ag and Forestry. As mentioned, the Secretariat here in Ag and Forestry has a 28% operating increase in the Office of the Secretary. There is the statutory transfer of wine promotion funding that totals almost $800,000 across all three bills from the additional revenues of the wine leader tax. There is the funding of $300,000 and 2 FTEs that accompany Senator Dance's bill for the industrial hemp program, expanding that at VDAX, and that funding again accompanies the legislation that is proposed. There is language that recommends that VDAX and the Health Department assess the long-term funding and fee structures for the food safety and restaurant inspection programs, including the consolidation of those 2 programs, and a contemplation of assessing the adequacy of the current funding structure and fee structure. With respect to the APHID program, it maintains the current funding level of $1 million per year. There is a new initiative at Forestry, which is a one-time increase of $236,000 for production of containerized longleaf and loblolly pine seedlings. And there is language within the Racing Commission to expand the definition of simulcast racing to include pre-recorded races, and authorizes the development of the regulations around the expansion of that program. Turning to natural resources, the Economic Development Natural Resources Committee met this morning and had a very detailed overview of the budget, so I will not dwell, but it does include $22.5 million in fiscal year 19 based on the fiscal year 17 revenue surplus for deposit to the Water Quality Improvement Fund. The code does require the governor include that in his introduced bill. There is a proposal for north of $500,000 over the biennium to expand Wi-Fi connectivity at state parks. There is a new initiative of $500,000 over the biennium to establish an urban open space preservation grant program at the Virginia Outdoors Foundation. The transfer to the game department from the hooks and bullets tax is increased by $1.6 million in 29, and then the transfer over the biennium to the game protection fund from the general fund is $33.7 million, and all the land conservation programs are level funded at the amount that they are in Chapter 836 of $5.75 million in each year. There is a lot of language in capital outlay projects related to the implementation of recent settlement agreements. The non-general funds total $6.6 million at DCR, DGIF, Historic Resources, and the capital outlay authorizations will have been discussed some at the capital outlay subcommittee already, but that all relates to both the DuPont and Surrey Skiffs Creek agreement. Part of that is the opening of the Middle Peninsula State Park and the additional non-general fund operating cost and 3 positions to begin opening that park in the current biennium, should the General Assembly remove the language in the budget that prohibits DCR from accepting any new land. Those natural resources capital outlay projects are listed on this slide here. That includes $20 million for the Alexandria Combined Sewage Overflow, the new projects at Game and Inland Fisheries, some of which are funded from settlement revenues, some of which are funded by game revenues, 3 new natural area preserves, an expansion of York River State Park infrastructure, which would be bond revenues, and renovations of some civilian conservation corps cabins. Those are more expensive for renovation than your standard state park cabin. All of this on this slide is non-general fund or bond revenue. No questions in natural resources, ag, and forestry. I will turn to transportation. At the Department of Motor Vehicles, there is a proposal to establish a line of credit beginning in fiscal year 18 that totals $20.7 million to cover the assumed costs and increased workloads associated with federal Real ID compliance. Primarily, that funding will be used for 96 additional positions at DMV offices across the state. The line of credit would be replayed from a one-time voluntary surcharge of $10 on customers that choose to purchase compliant credentials. There is also a replacement of a fuels tax collection system. This $7.1 million in non-general funds comes from the deobligation of some existing and pending DMV capital projects that would then use the funding for the IT system replacement instead. With respect to the Transit Capital Replacement Program, there is $110 million in transit capital bonds proposed in fiscal year '20. I understand that there may be legislation that would increase that amount from $110 million in 1 year to $550 million over 5 years. I have not seen the bill yet. The authorization in the budget, however, is for 1 year and is intended to replace the current bond proceeds authorized in 2013 that expire in 2019. While VDOT will be servicing the debt, it does count against the state's debt capacity. Overall, statewide transportation revenues are increased by $1.7 billion in the forecast. That comes from the revised CTF forecast in December, a one-time concession payment of $503.9 million related to I-66. We anticipate there may be a request for an additional concession payment appropriation to reflect the 95 deal that was announced at the end of the McAuliffe administration. And it does, pardon me, appropriate the assumed revenues from the imposition of additional taxes in Northern Virginia. And that amount is approximately $101.3 million over the biennium. And those taxes include imposing a floor on the regional motor fuels tax, increasing the grantor's tax by a dime to 25 cents per $100 in value, increasing the TOT from 2% to 3%, and then also redirecting existing revenues to the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission to WMATA. At the Senator Sassler.
Jason, excuse me.
Yes, sir. Mr. Chairman.
Yeah,
Senator Sassler.
I would remind everybody here, could you go back to that last slide, that when I guess it was 2313,
Yes, sir.
when that left the General Assembly and went to the governor, it was at 0.25, and he lowered it back to 0.15 in the veto session. And the transient occupancy tax, I think, was 3%, and he lowered it back to 2%. So essentially, the bulk of us in here have already voted for that once in 2013, Mr. Chairman.
I would say, Senator Sassler, looking at the universe as it exists, that there'll probably be some discussions about quid pro quo. Jason.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Turning to the Virginia Port Authority, there is an interesting proposal in capital outlay that involves essentially a debt-to-cash swap, cash-to-debt swap by taking $20 million of existing VDOT funds that would be used, this Commonwealth Transportation Fund dollars used for capital outlay projects, putting bonds on those projects, freeing up $20 million and deploying that $20 million in resource at the Port Authority in order to begin preliminary engineering work for dredging and widening the Norfolk Harbor Channel. That is part of an anticipated $800 million project should we elect to go forward. It is my understanding that the $20 million may be eligible for federal reimbursement from the Army Corps once moving forward in that project. There is a recommendation for $2 million in general funds each year to provide grants to qualified companies at the Economic Development Zone grant program. You will recall this proposal comes before us with frequency, and we have previously directed those grants be funded out of the Governor's Opportunity Fund, the Commonwealth Development Opportunity Fund. There is also a proposal for 21 additional FTE across all aspects of port operations, including economic development, logistics, office administration, police, and procurement. The port also has a significant number of non-general fund capital projects that includes new equipment at the APM terminal, cargo handling equipment on the Norfolk side, Portsmouth Yard expansion, an increase in the Virginia International Gateway capital lease, and some maintenance reserve projects.
Jason, if I could interrupt you on the port, perhaps you could provide some encouragement. I would like a comparison from the court as to the number of full-time management employees that existed prior to Mr. Roundhart coming on to the port and contrasted with where we are now numerically and dollar-wise.
Mr. Chairman, I will communicate the request if they are not watching this presentation presently. Transportation capital projects are summarized here again, all non-general funds. That includes the DRPT transit capital, the cash for debt swap, a new proposal for $25 million in statewide capital outlay for VDOT, $5 million capital maintenance reserve for VDOT, and then the Port of Virginia capital projects that I just discussed. If there are no more questions, Mr. Chairman, in transportation, I have one more secretarial area that may no longer be a secretarial area at the end of this session, though I have not yet seen the legislation for that as well. Turning to technology. There is $2.3 million in Senate Bill 29 to repay a working capital advance for the Virginia Enterprise Applications Program. This has been hanging out on the books of the Commonwealth since the program was terminated. If we do not provide the funding for this, it will be held as a restricted asset on the books of the comptroller, so the general fund would be unavailable for appropriation either way. It adjusts the non-general funds at VITA by approximately $22 million to reflect the cost of living increases included in the current Northrop Grumman contract, as well as adjust for anticipated agency usage. It recommends $1.5 million over the biennium and for FTE for the increased utilization of the Shared Security Center. That is where small agencies can use VITA services to improve their information security at their agencies. And there are 2 actions related to IT disentanglement that provide the requisite funding to transition to new IT services at the end of our current contractual obligations. From that, $5.4 million in non-general funds is for direct expenses, including the consulting and legal services around our ongoing court case, and $20 million is an increase in the line of credit, bringing the line of credit to $95 million to address anticipated disentanglement costs. We know that we have to pay this cost. The contract was structured in a way that could potentially have transitioned some of those costs to an incumbent vendor, but we want to make sure the Commonwealth is in the best negotiating posture as possible as we move forward. If there are no questions on technology, I will turn it over to Adam.
Thank you, Jason.
Morning, Mr. Chairman.
Good morning, Adam.
So in the general government area for SB 29 in the judicial, executive, finance, and administration areas, there are just a couple of items that have an impact to general fund resources. First, there is a proposal to revert $1.5 million in criminal fund balances from FY17 to the general fund. And in the AG's office, in the revolving trust fund, there's a proposal to increase the non-general fund appropriation by $500,000, which would have the corresponding effect of reducing general fund resources by $500,000 as well. A couple items that are reducing expenditures as well. There is a reversion of $1.1 million related to the salary compression initiative for sheriffs based on a reestimate of the number of sheriff's office employees that qualify for the benefit. In tax distributions to localities, a couple of items. Rolling stock taxes down of $600,000, and then the payments in lieu of taxes to the Tennessee Valley Authority of $100,000, and then debt management savings of $24.3 million, and that's related to refundings in VPBA and VCBA debt. And in the compensation, central appropriations, and independent agencies areas, in the revenue cash reserve, there's a proposal to add $121.4 million to the reserve. That would bring the total to $156.4 million. And of the $121.4 million, 42.2 of that is related to the tax amnesty program of 2017. And there's a companion action in the big bill that would propose another $270.7 million that I will speak to momentarily. There's $1.2 million general fund for the Slavery and Freedom Heritage Project for planned expenditures for the city of Richmond. And there are $4.7 million in savings for VITA rates based on IT and telecom utilization for 2018. Okay, so looking at SB 30 in the legislative, judicial, executive, and administration areas, to start, for mental health dockets, $1 million over the biennium for new mental health dockets or existing mental health dockets with high caseloads. There are currently 9 mental health dockets with 2 in the works. Normally, general fund dollars haven't been spent on the mental health dockets. This is usually asset forfeiture proceeds, local dollars, and so forth. There's $800,000 over the biennium for the expansion of drug courts. And so that would bring the total for the Supreme Court to about $5 million annually for the drug courts. And there's a language proposal that would have a drug treatment court advisory committee determine the allocation of those resources for drug courts. There's $175,000 each year and 2 FTEs to evaluate drug courts and work on grant application activities. There's currently one position in the Supreme Court that performs this function. There's roughly $288,000 each year for one circuit court judicial position. It was expressed that would be for the 20th Judicial Circuit, but there's not language that actually specifies that it would go to the 20th Circuit, so there's just funding for one judge out there. In the Indigent Defense Commission, they're requesting to replace all their outdated computer equipment, and they want to use the Master Equipment Lease Program. This reflects two years of a 5-year program. That would be about $900,000 over the course of the 5 years. HAVA funding backfill, there's $5.2 million each year in 12 FTEs, and that would be the general fund backfill of the total NGF appropriation for HAVA, which expires in the current fiscal year. And that began, I believe, in about 2003. So it's been about 15 years of HAVA funding that has been used over the course, and that's finally been fully depleted. Jail per diems, about $400,000 the first year and $1.4 million the second year, which is a lower amount than you historically would see based on having funded the full each year of the current biennium and lower offender population forecasting. And again, there's the reversion for the sheriff's salary initiative based on the reestimate of those who qualify for the benefit. And then there's $1.5 million in the second year for jail capacity at the Prince William and Manassas Adult Detention Center. And last slide in general government, there's the revenue cash reserve, a proposed $50 million in the first year and about $221 million in the second year, which would bring the total amount to about $427.1 million. In higher ed, as April mentioned, there's $13.1 million. I'm sorry, I didn't advance the slide. Or did I advance the slide? Where am I? There we are. Okay, I got you. $13.1 million for the rebates, for credit card purchase rebates and interest earnings based on restructuring performance measures having been met. As Jason mentioned, there's the proposal to increase in the Secretary's office about $160,000 each year. The tax audit initiative that Charles mentioned that has a revenue impact of about $18 million. That would be $600,000 first year, $700,000 in 8 FTEs to do tax audits that are proposed to generate those additional general fund resources. There's a 2% raise, $49.4 million in the second year. That reflects about 7 months of a raise in the second year of the biennium. And for the state employee health plan premium increases, it's about $118 million over the biennium, and that reflects an increase of 6% the first year, 8.5% the second year. There's also a proposal for the state to pick up the employee share of their rate increases, and that totals about $13.8 million over the biennium. And then, as Sarah mentioned as well, the VRS rate savings, which total about $13.3 million over the biennium. And I believe that concludes my area of general government. If there are any questions, otherwise April will take over capital outlay.
Any questions of Adam regarding his presentation?
All right.
If not, thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will conclude with the presentation with capital outlay. For a number of you who are on the capital outlay general government subcommittee, this will look familiar, so I'll try to move through it very quickly. In Senate Bill 29, there's only one major action to discuss. There's a reversion of or deauthorization of $12.5 million related to the CCAM facility, the Center for Commonwealth's Advanced Manufacturing. That debt is not necessary, and they have since gotten a federal grant related to that, which was the matching funds. There is in Senate Bill 30, in general fund cash, $15 million of the biennium related to planning, which I will cover in a minute. And then there's $453.7 million in the Virginia Public Building Authority and Virginia College Building Authority tax-supported bonds. There's $21 million in 9C revenue bonds, and that requires its full faith and credit of the, those revenue bonds have the full faith and credit of the Commonwealth. So for that reason, there's legislation that's required, and we'll see that bill tomorrow. There are 9D revenue bonds of $260.7 million, and those are, again, those revenue bonds, both of those relate to higher education projects, and they have fees associated that pay those bonds. Under non-general fund cash, we have $223.6 million for a total overall of about $974 million. And some of Jason's non-general fund transportation debt is not counted in that amount, however, but this is in the capital outlay section of the budget. Of those VPBA, VCA bonds, $252 million is specifically for central maintenance reserve, $127 in 1 year and $125 in the second year. The difference is there's $2 million additional for Fort Monroe in that first year. There's $52 million for equipment for capital projects nearing completion. There's $51.6 million in tax-supported debt for the renovation of 6 projects. And within that amount is $20 million for the combined sewer overflow matching funds for the city of Alexandria, which Jason mentioned in natural resources. There's almost $45.5 million in bonds to supplement existing capital outlay pools. There's $32.6 million for 5 standalone projects. And Jason already mentioned that $20 million related to facilities, and I mentioned the planning. So moving on to slide 78, these are the new planning projects, that $15 million. The planning requires cash, so this is general fund cash. And some examples include state police, replace the training academy, Central State Hospital, detailed planning under the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services, and some expansion and renovation at Deerfield Correctional Center at Corrections.
Can I ask one question?
Senator Carrico, yes, sir.
When you're talking about replacing the training academy, is that the Chesterfield Academy or?
Yes.
So what's that property worth right there? Are you replacing it or are you just adding to it?
I believe it is on the existing site. We're going to discuss that further, I believe, in public
Okay.
safety, but we can, if you want to know specifically the value of the land, I can also follow up on that.
I didn't know if it was in the planning to replace it and sell that property and move somewhere else, or if
I
it was.
believe it's on the same site, Mr. Chairman, Senator Carrico.
Because the property's probably worth a lot in value.
I'd be happy to follow up and provide some details on that. All right. Moving on to slide 78, this is the new capital 2018 session capital construction pool as it is listed in the budget. You'll see a number of projects here. And Sarah mentions the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. I won't cover that. There's some things at corrections. One of those projects there was something that we swapped out last year due to an emergency. So we're picking back up that Buckingham wastewater treatment plant if you approve those actions in this. And then there's also some replacement of the hot water and heating mechanical systems at Sussex 1 and 2 and Red Onion. Those are sort of high priority, high need projects. Southwest Virginia Higher Education Center, they are asking to replace the HVAC system. And I've already mentioned the combined sewer overflow as well. And then the final one on that slide is the headquarters building for the Department of Blind and Visually Impaired. Slide 80, here are some of those standalone projects I mentioned previously. There's some patient and safety issues at state facilities. That's an umbrella project. That's not at just one institution for the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services. Jason mentioned those items at Conservation and Recreation, so I'll skip over that. There is at the Monroe Building a project to replace the critical systems. I believe that was in the previous budget, and you did not approve that one, though it's risen to a higher critical level. Under Department of Military Affairs, there's $3 million to improve readiness centers. There's, Jason mentioned transportation, and there's some additional system infrastructure repairs and improvements for the School for the Deaf and Blind. On slide 81, under other actions and capital, Jason mentioned the transit bond, so I'll skip that one. Under Department of Corrections, language in item 391E exempts the Department of Corrections from the capital procurement requirements of the DGS, or General Services Construction and Professional Services Manual, as well as capital procurement legislation that passed last year. So we will dive into those details more in the Capital Outlay General Government Subcommittee. For the Department of Alcoholic Beverage Control, there is language in Central Capital Outlay that just provides authorization for ABC to continue with the new warehouse administrative office project building upon completion of that plan as authorized in the previous budget, and then the submission of the plan to the chairman of both the money committees, the governor, and the Capital Outlay 6-year advisory committee. And if there are no questions, Mr. Chairman, I believe that completes our presentation, but I do have an announcement related to budget amendments.
Does any member of the Finance Committee have any questions of April regarding her capital presentation? Any other matters to come before the committee? If not, thank you.
I was just going to make an announcement, if I could, about the budget amendments, if you don't mind.
Go for it.
I apologize. I just wanted to mention that your LA should have received the member budget amendments this morning. They will be delivered to you as well on the floor at noon. And any changes that you might have are due by by 5 p.m. today. And also on Thursday, we have an additional meeting this week at 4 p.m. to hear those members who were not on the Finance Committee if they'd like to come and discuss their budget amendments. And Mr. Chairman, I apologize for the interruption, but that concludes the announcement.
April, thank you and the entire Senate Finance staff for a very comprehensive overview, and we appreciate the effort and look forward to a continuing discussion with you.
Thank you.
With that, the committee will rise.